guys want to have a seat here, there's a few seats open. So thank you for being here. I have about 5 or 7 minutes. We can take questions as well. I want to sort of, did everybody get the big picture message from keynote yesterday? Yes? Yes? Okay. So I won't repeat any of that. What I want to sort of start off by saying there is software that Omar mentioned, and then there is software, okay? The real software. So let's not confuse software and software. I think we need to sort of separate, the firmware, the drivers, the low levels of the stack, with the millions and millions of lines of code that exists on top. So today what I was going to do is give you the landscape, which is kind of the talk, and some of the case studies on how different verticals are using the software stacks. And this is mostly in the open source world. Okay, so the progress has been made from an OCP perspective and from a Linux Foundation perspective on one industry segment, which is the cloud networks, the cloud deployments, whether it's Microsoft, Facebook, Alibaba, Google, doesn't matter. That's kind of one vertical. They have special needs, hardware, software, whatever. I'm going to take you into another vertical today with some case studies from the telco world as well. Because for them, network is also extremely critical, and what they're doing to innovate in the open source world. We will not talk about enterprise today because we don't have all the time, but we can go into that as well. Okay? So that's the context of what I want to sort of talk about. So I showed the stack yesterday at the keynote, and it essentially talks about hardware at the bottom layer and then the entire stack at the top. Now, the intersection of OCP and Linux Foundation is really in three things, as we talked about yesterday. One is, how do you make sure software runs on hardware and hardware runs with software? So there's a testing component to it, which is what OPNFV, or a project that is on the very left, that goes across software all the way up the stack down into the hardware. So that's kind of one. The second level of intersection is what I call the operating systems, or the NOSes, as Omar mentioned. And we have a whole community of NOSes that are optimized for cloud, Sonic, etc. That are optimized for carriers, DNOS, etc. And moving to enterprise, coming to the Linux Foundation. So we're going to collaborate a lot on how they all come together, and we will make life easy for the ASICs and the hardware vendors to make sure that the interfaces are standardized. Okay, that's kind of our promise. And then everything on the top, whether it's the network control, application, virtualization, operating systems, analytics, all the way to the top are very, very complex pieces of software, over 10 million lines of code, written by 1,500, 2,000 software developers, which I won't go into any detail. But the key message for this audience is, in the software world, we are creating what is called platforms of innovation. So if you want to automate network for services, you have a platform called ONAP, Open Network Automation Platform. And this is now going to be the de facto platform for over 60% of the carriers globally. And it's going to be harmonized with standards, and sort of that layer of software is starting to kind of come together. Okay? If you want to redesign a central office, there are platforms like Cord that are driving a lot more de facto open source platforms. If you want to go and work on a cloud, there is one platform called Kubernetes that has been, the fastest growing and the most important project. It used to be a Google project, but now it's like Linux Foundation, and we are just, gaining huge support from the community. For IoTs, it'll be an EdgeX Foundry platform, which essentially gives you the framework of getting services from an IoT gateway. For cloud native apps, it's Cloud Foundry. For all of blockchain, it's Hyperledger. And for AI, it's something called Acumos, right? And this is, again, higher layers of the stack. I know some of you may not relate to it here in the audience, but it is important to understand that software is being written as platforms that interoperate and integrate with each other, just like PCI buses and drivers and controllers, and how we did hardware ways years ago, okay? And so Linux Foundation has this structure where we have projects with governance. We look at cross-project dependencies, whether it's all the layers of software or down into the end-to-end testing, etc. So I won't go into the details of that. And then, of course, like anything else, it's a whole community of leaders, and then there's more and more, and it's just pretty much all of them. So let me spend like 5 minutes on what the telcos are doing. So as an example, while we love hardware, bulk of the time people spend on at the operators is on software. So what AT&T is doing is it's taking a project called ONAP, which is now in production, and they're doing POCs to move networks, both physical networks and virtual networks, into the next generation automated infrastructure, right? Huge project undertaking. And in that undertaking, there's a huge push to network disaggregation and white boxes. Okay, so you will see a lot of announcements next week around that, both from an operating system perspective, as well as AT&T's access push in terms of disaggregation at the Open Networking Summit in LA next week, right? China Mobile, the largest carrier, right? What they're doing is the network function virtualization. So again, this is the higher layer of the stack. Underneath is all physical infrastructure. And by the way, remember, the goal of software is to abstract the hardware in such a way that you can switch and mix and match, right? Commercial, open source, doesn't matter. And so they're redesigning their entire data centers, 2020 data centers, with full, open source based, what they call telecom integrated cloud. Orange, the global carrier, they're doing the same thing. They're starting to take every function and starting to virtualize it on commercial hardware. Bell Canada already announced that they are in production, in the data center, in the network space, right, with this software. And if you imagine the number of hardware devices that are connected in the production, it's mind-boggling, right? All the way from appliances to base stations to servers, compute, storage, the whole thing. And it's being automated by an open source software project, right? Same thing on Vodafone. And then several others that we won't talk about. But the point is there is a commercial building that is happening not just at the carrier level, but also by a lot of vendors supporting it. So the ecosystem is really, really thriving on top. And what we owe to the community is making sure that we don't fragment the ecosystem. That's what LF is championing. Okay. As part of that, at the LF booth, as you may have seen, we are showing some demonstrations on how OCP hardware gets tested. There's a certification program that has been launched, and we've already seen multiple vendors certify their own software solutions as well as hardware solutions with the stack. And then a whole set of standards communities, right? MEF, TM Forum, et cetera, et cetera. Again, remember, these standards are at the highest level of the stack. What we're going to work with and collaborate at the lower layers of stack is the SAIs and the ONIs and the ONLs and the drivers, right? So P4, et cetera. So there's a lot of low-level interfaces to the chips and the forwarding layer that we will harmonize in the industry. But I just wanted to give you guys a sneak peek at the higher layers of the stack, okay? And then one final thing, as we look at the next 2 to 3 years, there are adjacent technologies that are hugely impacting and influencing how we think of network, okay? And whether it's the service providers, whether it's the cloud or the enterprises, you can see the technology. This technology showcases what Open Networking Summit is about next week. So for those of you who are networking, don't miss this. Use this code OCS18 or whatever. It'll knock you 40% on the registration. So don't delay. It'll get sold out. It's in a hotel. So that's kind of my quick 5 minutes. There's a white paper, obviously, on how open source works. So am I out of time, or do we need questions? 1 or 2 questions? Where can we find the slides? What's the normal process, Omar?
I think all the talks will be available on video afterwards.
Okay.
I don't think we make the slides themselves, the decks themselves available, but the talks are recorded.
Screenshots.
a lot of the projects that you show, and at some point, for example, like the DPDK, ODP, there are a lot of overlap in those projects. So how do you manage?
No, so I didn't have time to go into that. They all have, so you will see multiple projects within a layer of technology, right? So let's say data plane and now abstraction. There's like 5 projects. They all start off with a specific use case, and then eventually they build on each other. So for example, DPDK is a set of libraries on which FDIO is built so that the VPP and the data plane can work, which OPNFV tests. So once you get into the projects, you will see that they all build on each other. Our job, if we find that there is complete overlap, we merge them, okay, in the open source community, and we work with the communities to merge them. Classic example was, the way ONAP was created was there were 2 communities, OpenO and Ecom, that we had to merge, and we can discuss and merge that. But classically, we don't want to stifle innovation, so any open source project can be started. And there are millions of open source projects, right? The ones Linux Foundation focuses on are the ones that need a community and that end users are really, interested in versus a simple PhD project that's put on GitHub, right?
So maybe one more question.
Oh.
Feel free to punt this to a longer question if you want, but a big theme of your talk was avoiding fragmentation. We have to avoid fragmentation. The open source that I know is 100% about fragmentation. If you don't believe me, I can start an Emacs versus VI debate, or Linux versus FreeBSD, or window manager debate. Can you talk to why you think avoiding fragmentation is important? Because that's certainly not the history of open source.
Yeah, so that actually, this can go on forever. The most important, so fragmentation for the sake of innovation is good. We always like, specific use cases and, it's open source. Anyone can start. What differentiates a project is when it adds enough value for the end user and the community to start adopting it, right? And so if we start seeing that end users have, whether it's cloud, carriers, or enterprises, doesn't matter. If we start seeing people adopting it, and then there's a hesitation because, should I go this way or that way? Or should I go, which 3 options do I pick, right? That's when we start bringing the communities together. And not integrating the projects, but integrating how they relate to each other, right? Classic example will be, as we move forward, there are probably going to be 5 ways to access a device driver and a chip, and there's like new ways, old ways, traditional ways, P4 ways, this way, that way. Broadcom will have one, someone else will have, like you name, the chip vendors will have all different ways to access that, right? Now, that's great. But the white box vendors and the NOS vendors are like, what do I do, right? And then the end users are saying, I need some alignment. That's where we come in. So, keep in mind, end users will drive the consolidation, or I would even say harmonization, not consolidation, harmonization, which is either interoperability or interworking and eventually a merge. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you. Please help me thank Arpit.